Hi, everybody. A quick overview of the Age of Revolutions, and then an equally quick introduction to Faust, Goethe's Faust, and Douglas's narrative. The first 2 weeks will be the first two works. Sorry, we'll be reading in this chunk of the course. After which we'll get into some lyrical poetry, which will give you a little bit of a break from some of these longer readings. Uh, this presentation, again, it's going to, I do these because I want to hit the highlights with you, and I want to add a few of my own thoughts. Listening to this is not a substitution for really carefully reading that introductory material in Norton. One of the reasons I consistently use the Norton anthology is because of the quality of those introductory essays. They're concise, they're not incredibly long, but they're also pretty thorough, and they do hit many key ideas. So I think they're a good introduction. So without further delay, I will walk through some of the main concepts I want to call attention to and add a few thoughts of my own. One of the things your text points out is, oh, my apologies, I'm trying to move the slide to the next slide, and I have my slide button covered here, and there we go. All right, I'll do a bloopers reel at some point. Um, this is a period of tremendous change, and some of that change is reflected in some of the new vocabulary and some of the new concepts that vocabulary reflects. In the past couple of weeks, we've been looking at the Enlightenment in Europe. Now, I would not say that the distinction between the Enlightenment and this period is a very sharp one. I think the Enlightenment builds up towards this. Yes, many of the things we're going to see are responses to certain Enlightenment ideas, but the whole notion of challenging authority, of the hope for human progress, and the vesting of value in the individual, that stuff we saw taking part or being planted, the seeds of that are being planted in the Enlightenment. We see it somewhat blossoming in this period we're exploring right now. So some of the things that the idea of the ordinary man, the average man being important. In other words, we're not just looking at stories of the aristocracy, the landed gentry, the bigwigs anymore. The average person is becoming a subject of literary interest, and the average person is gaining more and more power, partially because of the Industrial Revolution, which I'll talk about in just a second, because that has allowed the middle class especially to gain tremendous wealth. And it's kind of shown a spotlight on the working poor and just how awful their lives could become and how thoroughly they could be exploited uh, by those in power, that becoming now the factory owners and the people who were using their cheap labor in the centers of manufacturing. So notions like the factory, this is of course the place manufacturing used to take place in sort of cottage industries. You would have a cobbler whose family had all been cobblers, and they'd make shoes really usually out of their home, and then maybe sell them right out of that location, or maybe take them to a market, something like that. So now we do see mass production becoming kind of the norm. You see places built just to produce goods and sell goods. We don't yet have the assembly line and all that would come with Ford and his ilk, but we are getting this notion of places where things are produced. The middle class becomes increasingly powerful and forms around these kind of commoners who begin to gain power because they've begun to gain wealth through the benefits that they felt through the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism, the idea of the basis of economy being wealth, is something that's talked about more and more, both positively, but it's also critiqued very seriously. Industry, journalism, the idea of having people regularly writing and publishing news of the day really begins to gain currency and speed here. And these notions of liberal and conservative tending to be those who supported the practices of the past. So, for example, people who supported the monarchy would be conservative. The liberal would be those who were proponents primarily of human rights. And though the definition of human rights, as I mentioned in the Enlightenment as well, is a little bit fuzzy, because not all humans were always seen to be deserving of human rights. The Industrial Revolution, your text talks about two revolutions, and I'll go over these very quickly. Industrial Revolution essentially ends what has been, for as long as we remember throughout human history, a largely agriculturally based economy. Okay, a lot of things are fueled by and fuel the Industrial Revolution. Once you have this mass production of goods, suddenly you have a need to find new markets and a tremendous need for resources, and that fuels things like colonization, slavery. And slavery is, at least in the United States, really, really impacted by the textile industry and the need for increasing amounts of cotton because the cotton gin allows the very rapid and quick transformation of cotton into textiles. And one of the challenges, and we're going to see this as in a few weeks, we're going to watch a film introducing the Romantic poets, and we'll see William Blake's vision of the industrial England as he saw it. And one of the things that had become really appalling and that shocked a lot of people were just how awful working conditions were for the working poor. Factories were really places where people died young, and the very young worked there, and the conditions were just absolutely, absolutely awful. Political revolutions also were the kind of I don't want to say the norm, but they were flowering all over Europe and Latin America in particular, and of course in North America. This is a quote from Rousseau, and we're not reading Rousseau. I would say Rousseau's Confessions are definitely worth reading if you want a feel for the philosophical flavor of this time, and he inspired a lot of the thought of this time. But this quote, I think, is really, really, it represents a perspective. Humanity is born free. I should just read it. Man is born free, because again, there's a white male landed sort of definition of um, of the human being, or the person is deserving of human rights, and that varies from thinker to thinker, but it's very common. So man is born free, yet everywhere is in chains, and this is the call of revolution. That we have innate human rights, which entail a range of freedoms, and yet in the societies of the day, humanity is born into these strict hierarchies where they are denied those basic rights. The French Revolution, I'm not going to go into great detail about it because it's outlined in your text very well, and I've shared a crash course video on it. But the French Revolution really inspires a lot of what positive attitude towards revolutions, and then counter-revolutionary, very conservative responses, because the French Revolution flowers in this really brilliant way early on, and it's built upon the notion of human rights. The Bill of Rights that we add to our Constitution, Jefferson angled to get in there, inspired by the Bill of Rights that were produced by the French in the French Revolution. We didn't come up with that ourselves, and it was a bit of a struggle, and ours was much more limited than theirs. But then the horrors of the revolution, the really awful things that happened during that reign of terror, inspired a reaction. And one of those reactions, or not so reaction to, or an alternate reaction to the sorts of injustices that in some ways inspired the French Revolution. The French Revolution began largely over food riots, which is telling. But that's important to the Marxist idea at any rate. So let me get back to this slide and talk a little bit about Marxism. Among some thinkers, Marx and Engels being the ones who are most well known, the emphasis on how we understand the functioning of society started to come down to economic realities. And this idea that a tremendous amount of injustice is being perpetrated on the working person, the working man, and that the only way for there to be justice and equity going forward would be for that group, the proletariat, to organize and rise and seize control of the means of wealth production. So you basically had the perspective here, a working class which really owns fundamentally nothing, working for the people who own things. And that inequity was a real concern to Marx and Engels. In 1848, this is one of those moments where you realize that the language of contemporary events, or the language in which we describe contemporary events, oftentimes draws from history that we don't know about or we've forgotten about. In 1848, there's this kind of flowering of revolutions all over Europe. And I'll quickly show a map on the next slide, but you can look at the map more closely in the text. This is called the springtime of the peoples. And what did we see when similar uprisings began in the Arab world? It was called the Arab Spring. And that was really what was being appealed to. And I think that was the great hope of that moment, was that the some of the democratic reforms we saw in Europe would be echoed and this time, sorry, in 1848, would be echoed in the risings in the Arab Spring. But I don't know, global politics are such that people don't get left alone for long, and there are complexities and things to sit and work as we had all hoped. But um, this is what the vision of that was. Now, I would say even in Europe, you see this rise at the same time of nationalism, the idea of nationalism. The idea of nationalism leads into a lot of really nasty stuff in the 20th century. So although we see this flowering of states overthrowing these monarchies, some of the ideologies that took their place were kind of setting things up for some really awful things to happen later on. And here's that map of revolutionary Europe. I want to share as well, I want you to look at this map of the transatlantic slave trade. One of the things I'd like you to look at in the resources folder for next week is the crash course overview of the transatlantic slave trade as an introduction to the context in which Frederick Douglass is writing. Your text talks about revolutionary art and the way that the artist was seen as being in the position of either just repeating what was done in the past, sort of plagiarizing from the past, or doing something genuinely revolutionary. And of course, what we see surviving to today is the really revolutionary stuff. This is what we tend to cling to. The people who kind of sustained the neoclassical approach to art or wrote in the same old ways, they've kind of gone by the wayside. Two movements in art, for example, in visual arts, are Romanticism and Impressionism. And Romanticism has a significant literary presence as well, which we're going to look into in 2 weeks. So, oh man, I've got some corny jokes going. So here we're going to talk about the Romantics and the Impressionists. So you don't even know who these people are, probably. The Romantics are an 80s band, and this is Rich Little doing his impersonation, of Richard Nixon. So those are two really, really awful puns. But here's what we're talking about here. So in the graphic arts, here is a painting called The Death of Socrates. And you can see here, this is the neoclassical style, which is 18th century, really inspired by the classicism that we talked about being so much a part of Enlightenment art, this attempt to restore the greatness of the past by looking back at the classical tradition of the Greeks and early Romans. And you can see that very much here. Very formal setting, kind of a heavy moralistic theme, this sort of historical setting. It's very formalized, elegant, and staged. Now, Romanticism, Goethe, when you read the introduction to Goethe, you're going to hear that Romanticism, one of the things that is an element of this is focus on emotion. And The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is Goethe's probably best known novel, we're not reading that, but it's worth reading as well, is really all about that, just the way emotion can surge and shape and take things over. So here's an example of a very popular theme in Romantic poetry, and you can see the difference between the last image and this one. Nature is all powerful here. Humanity is being crushed by it. It's a very dreary kind of um, what sad, kind of threatening. It's an image that is infused with the sublime. It really challenges you, makes you think, not think, sorry, makes you feel. You'll notice that that kind of castle in the corner is interesting because the Romantics also introduce a lot of this appeal to medieval motifs and folklore that later evolve into a lot of the fantasy literature or inspire that, or Gothic literature, horror literature, even detective literature arises out of that sort of movement. And here, of course, is a very famous Impressionist painting. And you see again with Impressionism how those classical forms are shattered. And this is purely, it really is a Van Gogh's kind of subjective vision of this view outside his window as he was struggling with madness, and you really see the painting is less about what the image is than it is about what light is doing in the image, and the impression that that gives. Okay, 17 minutes. I'm going to quickly hit Goethe and a couple of things about Douglas, and then I will wrap this baby up. These are just the highlights of Goethe's life from the introduction. You should read again the introduction to Faust. He's a middle class guy. He studies law. He hits the world stage with the Sorrows of Young Werther. And your text mentions, I think this is a very funny thing, and I wish I'd thought to track down some, if there are images of surviving Werther paraphernalia that were sold. I guess he was sort of a really, really depressing Harry Potter of his age. There were manufacturers, people made things and sold things that were keepsakes. This guy just really influenced. He captured the popular imagination. This struggling young person who, in the end, is overwhelmed by emotion and kills himself. Sturm und Drang is what this style of literature is called. And it's just it refers to that sort of the tumult of the storm pouring through the surge of emotion and all that stuff that goes into these explorations of human desire and it's sometimes being thwarted. He served the Weimar court, which is interesting because he was not himself a radical in that sense. He actually was a court poet. He was brought to court, and the king, was supported him. At any rate, that's enough about Goethe. It's worth reading that introduction carefully, though. He's a very interesting figure. He inspires Germany in general. He's a German writer. Germany in general has tremendous impact on the Romantic movement, and even the Transcendentalist movement, which is kind of an American Romanticism, is heavily influenced not as much by Goethe, but by other German thinkers and writers as well. Little bit about Faust. Faust is about a guy who wants. And one of the questions for this week has you comparing two of his wants. He thirsts for knowledge, and in that way, he's someone we can sympathize with. And there's a certain nobility about his thirst for knowledge, but he also is just overwhelmed by physical desire, and that is another strain in what he is trying to get out of the devil once he makes this arrangement with him. This is an interesting quote that kind of brings those two things together. Thinking is done for me. I'm through. We'll plunge into time's racing current, the vortex of activity, where pleasure and distress, setbacks and success may come as they come by turnabout. However, to be always up and doing is man's nature. So he talks here about relinquishing contemplation. He's not denying his desire for knowledge here, but it's a passionate throwing of himself into his quest for desire. The figure of Gretchen is very important to the play. I won't read this quote to you, but she introduces an element of tragedy, and I think she opens a door to critiquing Faust, the character of Faust, to asking questions about what may be positive, not only positive in his kind of noble desire for knowledge, but what the darker side of his character might be. Mephistopheles is an interesting character. In some way, he's the protagonist of the play because he's the one who is kind of challenging what's going on all the time. He is in some ways the ultimate romantic figure here, not romantic in terms of being somebody that is going to be on the cover of People magazine every week, but romantic in the sense of challenging the established order. That really is Mephistopheles, and he challenges a lot of the assumptions that Faust brings to the table about human progress and the desire for the confidence that you can solve all things through this search for knowledge. Okay, so very interesting here. Pay attention. Again, it's a discussion question that asks you to reflect on these two characters. The style of the play is such that it really rejects the rules of unity of time, place, and action that we saw in Moliere, in Tartuffe. This idea that everything happens in one place in more or less the same amount of time that it takes for the play to be performed, and the action kind of wraps up, flows together, makes sense. Faust is all over the place, and one of the questions for this week's discussion again asks you to reflect on place in Faust, the number of places. He varies meter and rhyme. He's not slave to or settled on a single formal meter. One thing that's really interesting about this play is that Faust hadn't really written it to be performed, and that's really hard to grasp why someone wrote a play that wasn't going to be performed. But it was a literary form that to him fit what he wanted to express, and he crafted it in that form. It has since been produced, and I think contemporary or more recent stage technologies, I think, have made that easier. So it has been produced, but he wasn't that keen. It was produced in his lifetime, but he wasn't focused on having it produced. Okay, moving on to Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born into slavery. He was separated from his family, first from his mother, then later from his grandmother. He was taken from his grandmother at age 7 and went to live in the house of his owner. When his original owner died, he was sent to the Auld family in Baltimore, and this is where really his transformation begins, because Sophia Auld, the woman of the household, begins to teach him the alphabet and teach him how to read, and this opens a door for him. And this was illegal at the time, and her husband had a very strong reaction when he found out that she was teaching him to read. And to an extent, it's being illegal in this context makes sense, because what happens as soon as somebody can read? Well, Frederick Douglass demonstrates that to us, because the power of reading, he then begins to understand his situation better, and has the power to begin to change it. And the influence that he has, because he learns to read, he begins teaching other slaves to read. He eventually escapes slavery and then becomes a very, very popular speaker on the lecture circuit about all sorts of things. Douglass is distinctive. The narrative, not so much, but Douglass is distinctive in that he's not unique, but he's distinctive in that he really sees the sorts of freedoms he's calling for them for everybody. So it's not just for, in his case, men. He's also a strong supporter of the women's suffrage movement. A couple things about the narrative. It falls in the genre of a slave narrative, and I think that's something worth keeping in mind. It's not something that he just wrote out of the air, let me write an autobiography of my life as a slave. There were a number of these works out there, and they were published by, and some of them ghostwritten by, abolitionists, people who were working in the anti-slavery movement, as a way of exposing slavery. So Frederick's is distinctive because, I'm sorry, I'm using distinctive a lot in this lecture. It's my word of the day. Frederick's is distinct. Douglass's, sorry, is distinctive because it's literary quality. It's very well written, and it is written by him. And that was not the case with all of them. So it's very well written, and it really tells his story as he shaped it. But now he is writing it for literary effect, and there have been challenges to some of the facts. Not in a way. It's not. The challenges aren't taken from the perspective that, oh, he's a fraud, he's making this stuff up or whatever. But within the genre of the slave narrative, there are possibilities of emphases that are applied to his story, that to adapt to that genre and the purposes of that genre. So the literary effect is very important. And one of the things we introduce next week, or the week when we begin with Douglass's narrative, are approaches of literary criticism. And I mention this because your text actually raises a feminist critique of the work. So I'm going to introduce two, and again, one of the discussion questions is going to asks you to reflect on these two approaches. These schools of literary criticism are really approaches scholars have devised to trying to understand works of literature, and they're oftentimes informed by a lot of that scholar's own perspective on the world. So Marxist criticism, for example, is a form of criticism that arises from an underlying belief that in the end it is economics that drives society, that you understand works of literature best when you place them in that realm. In other words, you understand who wrote them, where that person's position in society was, who supported them, who benefited from the works. So there are works, for example, that are written that clearly support the powerful elite. And you can look at that, and from a Marxist perspective, see it reinforcing that. You can also look at works that are subversive and really understand them through that perspective of the relative power of various groups in society. Some of the questions, and I've given you a link to the Purdue Online Writing Labs overview of literary criticism, really nice and very concise. So some of the questions that Marxist critics tend to ask: whom does this work of literature benefit? Um, if people accept it, believe it, whatever, who benefits from that? What's the social class of the author, and then which class does the work claim to represent? That's interesting with Douglas because yes, Douglas is a former slave, but in many ways, Douglas is himself educated in a way that most slaves are not. So he is offering a perspective on slavery that is distinctive. Uh, that's that word again. It is my word of the day. That is in some ways unique to or shaped by his kind of ascent into the intelligentsia. He learns to read. He becomes um, um, somewhat of an intellectual, and again he gets his power. His voice gains his power when he becomes so popular on the lecture circuit. What values does the work reinforce or subvert? What conflict can there be seen between the works of the values that the work is championing or pushing and those it actually portrays? And then what social classes do the characters represent, and how do those social classes interact or conflict? Another approach that we're going to look at this time out is feminist criticism. And if you recall from the intro to Douglas in your textbook, the question that is raised there is, does Douglas give adequate weight or really portray the women in the autobiography in a way that empowers them? And in the autobiography or in the narrative, you can argue that no, he does not. And even though he himself was very supportive of women's rights, in the narrative, it's very much a man versus man sort of conflict between the slave and the slave owner. And women are somewhat marginalized and even objectified. I mean, the body of the female slave is oftentimes just a thing that suffers. You know what I mean? It's described as a, you don't have the sense of, his mother doesn't enter into the narrative in great detail. His wife doesn't enter into the narrative in great detail. Women who've had tremendous influence. At least that's the take that the feminist critics have taken on the book. In your response, if you choose that question, you were free to disagree with that. I'm not completely sold either way. I've not thought about this aspect of the narrative deeply enough. So it is open for debate. And that's it. And it's at 30 minutes, so I lied to you about making this short. But it's covered this week and next week's content, so I won't be posting a new presentation for Douglas. I'll be posting additional resources. So that is it. It's just a quick interview, which I hope is distinctive enough for you.